What is the Trump administration strategy here, and could Tomahawks exert the pressure needed to get Russia to the negotiating table? Let's bring in former NATO Deputy Secretary General Rose Gottemoeller. She is joining us now live from California. Rose, it is good to see you. So President Trump is coming off of what he's described as a peace victory in Gaza, and he's using, in his words, the same model to try to bring this war in Ukraine to an end. Is that a valid analogy in your view that he's making? Whatever went into the actions that got to that ceasefire in Gaza can be done now in Ukraine.
He certainly had to pressure the leader of Israel, Mr. Netanyahu, to get this solution, the ceasefire in Gaza. So I think he's looking to apply some tough pressure on Vladimir Putin. The question is how best to do it. The Russians have discounted, as you just heard, the Tomahawk as being, not a game changer in the war. On the other hand, it is a step in the direction of supplying a bigger and more capable weapon than the U.S. has supplied up to this point. So is this the way to do it? I'm not sure. There could be other inducements that the president may try on Vladimir Putin, such as opening up more economic opportunities. Those kinds of things have been very attractive to Putin in the past. So I don't think it's going to be a kind of unilayered response.
Economic opportunities, you mean sort of a carrot approach, that you stop this war and we can have further economic ties after the fact, or in the interim as well?
No, I don't want to say in the interim. I do think that it would be a carrot offered to get the war over with. The president greeted, Putin in Alaska at the end of the summer, and there was a big coterie of Russian businessmen along on that trip. And Putin, I know, was hoping to get some business opportunities, at least in the talking phase. So I do understand that Mr. Trump has that in his mind as well. It's a classic diplomatic approach, right? The carrot and the stick.
Right, but I'm just wondering, because I've picked up on that as well. President Trump has consistently talked about the great business and economic opportunities that await the U.S. and Russia once this war ends, and also continues to talk about the fate and the attrition of soldiers in this war, and Russians as well. Every week he throws out a number. These are 2 points that we don't hear from Vladimir Putin, and I'm just wondering if the president's focus is a bit miscalculated. We know that Russia's economy is facing some hardships, but they can withstand another few years at least, given where they are now in a wartime footing. And he seems to be just fine having Russia isolated where it is, but still remaining close with other BRIC countries in particular. And, the troop attrition, again, seems to be a bigger concern for Trump than Vladimir Putin.
Yes, and that's very odd because I think Vladimir Putin at this moment is playing a dangerous game. You may remember that back in 2022, there was consideration of another big mobilization in Russia, and tens of thousands of Russian men fled the country. And so Putin has been very, very hesitant to try another mobilization. But now they are changing the law, apparently, that limits the use of 2 million reservists. And they've got that before the Russian parliament, which is a rubber stamp. So it looks to me like Putin is considering doing a hidden mobilization, calling it a simple change in the reserve law. And in that case, I think he's showing some vulnerability because that was politically the bridge too far for him back in 2022.
Yeah, we'll see if a play on words will allow this to pass with the Russian people. Remember, for so long, he called this a special military operation
Yes.
before actually identifying it for what it was, and a war. You rightly mentioned that the pressure as of late that President Trump has put on Prime Minister Netanyahu to get to this deal. But one has to note that he essentially allowed the Prime Minister in Israel to continue not only aggressively on the ground in Gaza, despite the concerns and really the isolation of Israel from a number of other countries, but also taking on Iran as well to get to this point. I'm wondering, we've seen pressure that President Trump, especially early in this administration, the first few weeks, put on President Zelensky. Do you think that to get to a ceasefire anywhere near where we saw in Gaza, he should also perhaps start allowing President Zelensky to do a bit more before he then attempts to rein him in, if he does have that oversight over him in a way that he doesn't over Putin?
I really wanted to point to the effectiveness. All the attention is on the Tomahawks at the moment, but Zelensky himself has talked about the effectiveness of two new Ukrainian missiles, two new drones that the Ukrainians have been launching against Russian energy facilities. Their gasoline and petroleum producing infrastructure is quite damaged by a series of Ukrainian drone attacks, and now they put their new missiles to use there too. By some accounts, gasoline production is down 20% in Russia, and the Russians have had to import from Belarus in order to be able to supply their drivers with gasoline. So obviously, the Ukrainians have been very good with their own indigenous missiles at causing damage on the Russian side as well. And I can see the president definitely encouraging that kind of activity on the Ukrainian side when he sees Mr. Zelensky on Friday.
Yeah, he does seem to be impressed by military wins. He's said as much with regards to some of the strikes that Ukraine has successfully launched deep within Russia, the same in Gaza as well. I'm not in Gaza, in Israel, in terms of their strikes on Iran. As far as this meeting on Friday with President Zelensky and President Trump, what will you be looking at in terms of any tangible deals made coming out of it? Earlier in the segment, we talked about rare earth minerals perhaps being a deal that we see between President Trump and President Milei in Argentina. There was a rare earth deal in Ukraine we haven't talked about much at all as of late. But what will tell you that perhaps we've seen a shift in some strategy from President Trump with regards to this war?
Again, all eyes have been on the Tomahawks, but I actually think one of the more important discussions that's going on is the use of these so-called frozen Russian assets for the Ukrainian war effort and for eventually for reconstruction. And I know the Prime Minister of Ukraine is evidently in Washington now with a delegation to talk about this and other topics to prepare the way for the meeting on Friday. And I believe that if we see some U.S. movement, the U.S. has been quite resistant on using such frozen Russian assets. And so if there is some movement on that, I would say that that too will be a very significant change and pressure on Russia as well.
Right. And we have seen President Trump shift some of his views and even allow NATO U.S. weapons to be delivered to Ukraine after the sale of those weapons to NATO countries, and then they would supply them to the Ukrainians. We've also seen in the past that following meetings with President Zelensky, we see either a phone call or another meeting perhaps with President Putin. Do you expect to see that happen this time as well?
I don't expect it immediately, really. I know yesterday the president turned to Steve Witkoff and said, Steve, next we work on Russia. So I would expect the special envoy, Steve Witkoff, to be sent off perhaps to talk to the Russians again. And indeed, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman today, welcomed working again with Mr. Witkoff, said how they found him an effective negotiator. So they were turning a bit of a charm offensive also in the direction of Washington. So I would expect that we'll see some more shuttle diplomacy from Steve Witkoff, and that there won't be a lot of interaction immediately between Putin and Trump. But I am hopeful that we'll see a much more positive meeting on Friday at the White House with Mr. Zelensky than we saw last February when there was that disastrous meeting. I do think those two men now have a much better way of working together, a modus vivendi. And so I expect the meeting will be businesslike and I hope productive.
Yeah, we all do as well. Their relationship has improved significantly since that nadir moment there in February in the Oval Office. Rose Gottemoeller, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.